Good morning. My name is Kelley Vlahos, and I am the editor-in-chief of Responsible Statecraft, which is the foreign policy magazine of the Quincy Institute. If you aren't familiar with the Quincy Institute, we are an action tank dedicated through research, analysis, media, and advocacy to reorientating U.S. foreign policy away from militarism and U.S. primacy across the globe and towards diplomatic engagement and peace across the globe. I think today's topic is a perfect encapsulation of what we are attempting to challenge at Quincy in our mission: the Trump renewal of the drug war in Latin America, what it looks like today, and whether it can work as envisioned by the administration in new relationships with like-minded leaders across the region. This week's headlines could not be more salient. The White House announced over the weekend, after the presidential inauguration of Abelardo de la Espriella in Colombia, that it was launching a sweeping new anti-drug and security initiative that would bring both governments into close cooperation. Most notable, building, quote, interoperability and executing coordinated operations with U.S. forces to eradicate drug production and the armed networks inside that traffic and profit from them. This would be paired with economic initiatives that would open up Colombia's agriculture and critical minerals industries to U.S. investments. This comes directly from the Trump national security and defense strategies, which aspire to greater U.S. control of security and economic competition in the hemisphere in the spirit of U.S. national interest, and requires the assistance of aligned leaders on the right, like Espriella, to accomplish it. These partnerships can be forged, but do they have long-term impact? Our panel today is a little skeptical. I am looking forward to hearing their thoughts at a deeper level over the next hour. But first, let me introduce the members of our panel. Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera is a professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University and co-director of the Corruption Networks and Transnational Crime Research Center. She is author of Los Zetas Incorporated, Criminal Corporations, Energy, and Civil War in Mexico, which was published in 2017. Her newest book, co-authored with Sergio Chapa, is entitled Frontera, A Journey Across the U.S.-Mexico Border, and that was published in 2024. Isabel Pereira Arana is a longtime advisor on behalf of Colombia for International Cooperation Programs and is senior coordinator for drug policy at the Center for Law, Justice, and Society. She focuses on documenting the differentiated impacts of drug policy on women, the interactions between drug policy reform, health, and transnational justice, and pursuing drug policies rooted in human rights. And finally, last but not least, my colleague Lee Schlenker is a research policy associate with the Global South program here at the Quincy Institute. Previously, he worked with the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect, Center for Economic and Policy Research, and Witness for Peace, Solidarity Collective. He has been published in The Guardian, Newsweek, The Nation, The Hill, and of course, Responsible Statecraft. He recently published the Quincy brief, Demilitarizing Counter Narcotics, 25 Years of Evidence from Colombia, which we will no doubt be discussing today. So thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So let us get started. And before I do, for those who are joining us today on this webinar, please, if you have any questions for our panelists, use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will hopefully get to as many Q&A questions as we can fit and see fit over the next hour. So let us start. Isabel, I'd like to start with you. Colombia's new president, Espriella, has already joined the Trump administration's Shield of the Americas Consortium and America's Counter Cartel Coalition, created earlier this year to coordinate regional efforts to combat designated foreign terrorist organizations in the hemisphere. And then, as we mentioned over the weekend, the U.S. announces $1 billion to, is pledging $1 billion to ramp up coca eradication in Colombia, conduct these joint operations with the Colombian security forces, freeze financial assets, and prosecute executives that are enabling the trafficking. Can you discuss how the new Colombian administration's counter narcotics policy, or what we know of it, differs from past presidents' approaches, and what results you think that they are likely to yield?
Yeah, thank you, and good morning to everyone who's listening. So, to sort of simplify over 20 years of counter narcotics policies in the region, what we saw was that during the 8 years of the Uribe administration, there was a heavily securitized and militarized strategy towards counter narcotics and this conjunction of counterinsurgents with counter narcotics. Remember that back then, FARC as a main guerrilla group was still active. And while it had some results in the very short term, they were, of course, difficult to sustain in the long term, as we are seeing now. Uribe did manage to achieve the lowest rate of coca cultivation, but that was not sustained over time. Then we get to the Santos administration, where he combined some militarized approaches with some negotiation. So he had both of the strategies at play in the counter narcotic strategy, bringing as a result the negotiation of the Havana Peace Agreement agreed in 2016. And then we get to the Petro administration. His big, bold strategy was paz total, total peace, 8 tracks or 9 tracks, depending on how you count, of peace talks and negotiations with different armed groups, both political and non-political. And in terms of counter narcotics, a strategy aimed at voluntary substitution. But the success of that program has been questioned completely because the government sustains that they had a target of 30,000 hectares to be substituted voluntarily, and only 6,000 have been verified by the UN. And the total peace strategy, as it were, didn't have any success as well, and we're seeing a doubling or tripling of forces in illegal armed forces presence in the regions. And what we can see with the Abelardo administration, the new administration, is of course, as you were saying, they are aligning completely with the U.S. strategies, joining the Shield of the Americas, but it has some differentiation points from the securitized versions we had in the past. One main difference is that they are aiming to have direct U.S. operations in Colombia, which have not been the case ever. This has some implications, some constitutional implications that we are not clear how they will go about here in Colombia. It's also important to bear in mind that Abelardo de las Priella is a U.S. citizen as well. So this will sort of complicate the conversation for us, at least. There was a whole debate internally in Colombia before the election whose allegiance is primary to him. Is the allegiance that he swore in as U.S. citizen, or his allegiance as Colombian citizen? So that will be a complication. Then the other question is around, of course, crop eradication. Numerous governments have tried and attempted to resume aerial spraying with glyphosate. This was a campaign that was conducted for over 15 years with support from the US government under Plan Colombia. Around 2 million hectares were sprayed with a herbicide that has been classified as carcinogenic. But the Constitutional Court has set very restricted conditions to be able to resume this practice. And what the announcements of the new government seem to say is that they will try to circumvent these legal restrictions. And to what extent that will be possible I think will be at the end a test of the solidity of our institutions and our state of law.
I'm very concerned. You mentioned that this would be unprecedented, at least in modern history, to have U.S. troops integrating at this level. Can you talk a little bit about how fraught that would be? And does anybody have any idea of what it would actually look like? I mean, does that mean U.S. troops on the ground in Colombia? And how fraught would that be for U.S. military? Are they prepared
I
for
think we
such
all
an arrangement?
I think we all have the same various number of questions. One, it would be how fraught would that be in the relation between the Colombian military, the US military? Is it actually legally possible? Will the Constitutional Court here approve such a thing? Let's remember that in Ecuador last November, there was this referendum called by Novoa to approve the presence of US troops on the ground, and it was rejected, that public referendum. We do not know, it's not clear what would be the legal route to get approval for this, or if we're in a scenario where they would just try and do it and then check the legality of the thing after the facts are done. And then also, of course, there's a long-standing history of US and Colombia military cooperation, but it has been always in the sense of this technical assistance. But even then, there has been human rights abuses and a whole host of complications to that relationship when there was no food on the ground. And I think that that would be a question that I would also like to hear from you as well. How do you see that from the US side panning out in this context?
Yeah, Lee, would you like to tackle that question? I know I have some questions teed up for everybody, but I think it's important we just stay on this quick subject of the U.S. military involvement and engagement here. What does that mean for the U.S. military in this context here?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kelly. So, as Isabel mentioned, there is a long history here with U.S. military involvement and security cooperation with Colombia under the framework of Plan Colombia, billions of dollars in equipment, in security assistance, in training programs were delivered to Colombia in part to fight narcotics, but also to fight the FARC insurgency. But right now, Colombia's internal armed conflict is extremely different than it was 25 years ago. The armed groups in throughout Colombia's territories are far more decentralized. Their weaponry is far more advanced, including drone technology and UASs. There is a proliferation, as Isabel mentioned, of the membership, of the leadership, of the number of types of groups, the splintering that has happened. And a lot of the groups are present around international borders with both Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador, and to a lesser extent, Brazil. So I think sort of the traditional model that we saw either through operational support teams that would come in to train and advise during the Uribe administration would necessarily have to look very, very different in the current context. The other question is there was a $1 billion security pledge that was announced by the State Department this weekend. I'm not sure that on the sort of congressional appropriations side of things, what the time frame for that is, if this has been something that has bipartisan support, if we're talking about over the course of 1 year, over the entire administration, or if there's really an appetite within the U.S. Congress right now for that type of robust security assistance. And it's also important to remember that even during the administration of Gustavo Petro, despite tensions between the executives, with President Trump and President Petro, the security, intelligence, defense sectors, anti-narcotics police, the different institutions of the justice system continue to have very, very strong institutional relations with their U.S. counterparts. So, especially in the past year or the last year and a half of the Petro administration under the leadership of their defense minister, Pedro Sanchez, very, very close relations with Southcom. And while there weren't sort of U.S. troops on the ground necessarily, there are still naval, Air Force, military bases in Colombia that have, authorized U.S. troop presence for rotations and training purposes. So I think we should expect to see a qualitative leap in terms of potentially what we're seeing in Ecuador of prolonged deployment of U.S. troops for particular operations that will be high profile, that will be flashy, that'll make the news cycle. But I think the broader question is this going to be a winning strategy for actually sustainably reducing, coca cultivation, cocaine production, and weakening these armed groups, if not paired with credible negotiating strategies to actually degrade groups finances, their other illicit rents, and the criminal governance that they exert over a number of territories.
So, Lee, as I mentioned, you had just written a brief on this issue. You also traveled to Colombia recently. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw there, maybe some of your takeaways, and putting it in the context of your findings of the brief? Can you talk a little bit about your bottom line as to whether these initiatives actually can work? This militarized drug war initiative can work after all your research and your personal on the ground conversations with Colombians.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kelley. I mean, based off some of the research that I did for my master's at Georgetown, that was then converted into the brief, as you mentioned, and then followed up with pretty high-level conversations within Colombia, civil society, government, and other institutional actors. It's clear that we haven't quite cracked the code of what is the right balance between having a credible security strategy towards vis-a-vis Colombia and also a peace and development strategy that hits the right balance. Because again, I think past administrations have taken like a 70-30 approach or an 80-20 approach of like mostly security, operations, police presence, bombardments, offensives against groups, and only about 10-20% have been for development assistance, economic alternatives, credit, land titling, rural infrastructure to provide actual, alternatives for small scale coca growers. Whereas the Petro administration sort of took an inverse approach, where they mostly invested in sort of social and economic programs, but also that suffered from, lack of coordination, politicization within implementing agencies, and just coordination issues. Combined with maybe 20-30%, a credible security strategy in these territories. And the problem is that, coca cultivation is extremely concentrated in about 10 municipalities within Colombia. And somewhere we were told during the delegation that about 60-65% of those municipalities are in the territories where the plantations are. It's very, very difficult for even the security forces or government institutions to come in and establish a more durable presence. So again, this needs to be there needs to be a balance that's struck. I'm not positive that this incoming administration, through its its statements that it's made and the documents that it's published, and now of course with the earthquake is going to be even more challenging to follow through and to implement, has necessarily given much confidence that it's going to be striking that balance of maybe kind of like a 50-50 approach, where there is investment in improving state presence in ungoverned rural areas with historic lack of state presence, where there is, whether public, private, or multilateral funding for rural alternatives, crop substitution efforts that are actually viable and can replace illicit economies, in conjunction with these, sequenced manual eradication campaigns that, again, invest in some of these institutional building and security providing, factors before manually and ideally cooperatively ripping up some of the plants. Given, as Isabel mentioned, the aerial fumigation strategy has been tried. There's problems with it in terms of the balloon effect of people just moving these plantations to other areas or to other countries, and not killing the whole plant, adaptive and more productive strategies. So, and as well as, being paired with interdictions, which the Petro administration oversaw, a greater percentage of interdictions to production levels than other past administrations. So at the later stage of the supply chain, not just targeting the lower level growers, where much of the value is not really added for the final price of cocaine in international markets, but really at ports, and inspecting containers and at final destinations, which is really a lot more cost effective in terms of interdiction strategies. But yeah, I mean, what we heard on the delegation is it's been an ongoing challenge to strike this right balance and to sequence operations so that because there are serious security challenges, but again, they need to be also paired with real efforts to actually have opportunities and alternatives and state presence in legal institutions and efforts to combat corruption and impunity and collusion with business and political executives that enable these illicit economies to thrive.
Yeah. We'll get more to that too, the supply and demand issue later on. But I want to go to Guadalupe. I mean, Mexico, our closest, nearest neighbor. I would imagine there are times when Claudia Sheinbaum is happy that like Trump's attention is elsewhere because he started off his 2025 term being very aggressive with Mexico, and I can't say that it stopped. I mean, he has taken unprecedented steps to degrade the drug trafficking cartels. He's increased covert operations. He's enabled CIA. He's threatened unilateral strikes on Mexican territory. Issued indictments against government officials, levied sanctions. He's constantly threatening to start a war over this. How has Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexican president, how has she kept a balance, keeping him at bay, but doing her best to crack down on these drug trafficking organizations? Is there more that the two can do together without her ceding the sovereignty of Mexico to the Trump administration?
Thank you very much, Kelley, for this excellent questions and also our reflections. In the United States, by the way, I'm in Mexico City right now, and I was born and raised here and follow very closely the news stories and the media and social media in Mexico. It's the discourse in Washington, and you utilize the word drug trafficking organizations when you refer to the situation in Mexico. And the narratives, the rhetoric in the United States always connect violence and the problems in Mexico to U.S. national security interests. Of course, that is connected to United States drug war. And Mexico has adopted that war as well. I mean, has inherited and implemented that, which is about militarization of counter-narcotics operations. And first under the Merida Initiative, then under the so-called bicentennial framework, and now we really don't know what's going to happen. I mean, this denomination changed it all. Mexico has problems that go beyond drugs, and the so-called drug-related violence is connected to other criminal activities. The diversification of criminal activities in Mexico is huge, and now the groups that have threatened societies, communities, and have in fear a number of communities in Mexico have nothing to do with drugs. They deal with fuel theft, human smuggling, human trafficking, and extortion. Basically extortion, mainly extortion. That has nothing to do with United States national security interests. And if we don't understand that we're not talking about drug trafficking organizations that are really controlling territories, organizations that have leadership like, the family of El Baño Zambada or El Chapo Guzman, and now the ones who inherited those leaderships. If we don't understand that, we're not going to address these things. And Claudia Sheinbaum has the national problems and also its connection with the United States and talking about sovereignty that has given Claudia Sheinbaum the capacity to say, well, or to center on this focus on we are defending sovereignty, but I'm not going to deal with the problems that have to do with my people, that have nothing to do with drugs and national security interests. So in a way, the United States has a rhetoric that allows the Department of War and the U.S. government to have more, to have more control over the territory of Mexico and the Americas overall under this idea of the shield of the Americas, which does not connect with the reality of what we're living in the Americas, particularly Mexico, because there are matters that are just business of Mexico, and not everything is connected to drug trafficking organizations or drug cartel. We're dealing with criminal networks. We're dealing with different enterprises that connect at certain points in certain spaces and have political protection as well of members of the party of Claudia Sheinbaum. If we do this only and connect this discussion to drugs, we are under, of course, of the national security interest sphere. And this is very bad for Mexico because Claudia Sheinbaum is just, trying to deal with Trump in different ways, accepts a number of its requests, and some of them don't, because let's remember that in April 2026, U.S. prosecutors indicted the governor of Sinaloa and nine other current or former Mexican officials on allegations that they protected the Sinaloa cartel. And the Treasury has also undertaken increasingly broad actions against financial and commercial networks, including sectors that connect to the CJ&G, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. But that does not depict the reality of the country. And you're not going to deal with a problem in the United States, the fentanyl crisis, and Claudia Sheinbaum is not addressing the needs of Mexicans, extortion mainly, and it's really focusing on trying to deal with the situation with Trump, and it's just political. We're not really dealing with the issues that are affecting our societies. In the United States, the fentanyl crisis, and in Mexico, the violence and the extortion and the extraction of rents.
And just to be generous, is she just trying to keep Trump at bay so that he doesn't launch some sort of kinetic war on Mexico? Like how much, or is she just using the drug war vis-a-vis the United States as a scapegoat, or at least just sort of a deflection from having to deal with these more entrenched problems in your society? Or a little bit of both.
That is what is happening. There is a very important decrease or an important decrease in the number of homicides, but the criminal networks or the members of the criminal network in different spaces at the local level, that does not probably have to do with a centralized authority in the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación or the Cartel de Sinaloa, because that's not the way we have to deal or at least conceptualize what we're living in Mexico. We're dealing with criminal networks in a complex adaptive ecosystem that it's criminal, but that's not connected with drugs only. So homicides are going down, but these groups exercise more territorial control at different levels. And the problem is that disappearances, extortion, has become the norm in certain regions. And that's something that the United States-Mexico cooperation is never going to deal with. And so Claudia is saying, we're going to defending sovereignty. And she's trying to negotiate certain spaces. She started, when Donald Trump arrived to power, she sent the National Guard, members of the National Guard, to the border, leaving the communities alone that needed the National Guards to do the work. So basically, this is helping her to say, regionally, she is recognized as a leader that is dealing very well with its relationship with Donald Trump, that keeps her head calm and cold, and that she's the real leader. But in reality, Mexicans are dealing with more problems because probably people are not dying in the same numbers, but still is very high, the rate of homicides. But they have to pay sometimes piso for everything, for buying tortillas, for growing every single type of products, and for crossing through territories, for existing basically. And that's not being addressed. So we are having different conversations in different places. And that's the problem.
Yeah, that, and I appreciate your insights on this issue, because I don't think Americans really grasp the full breadth of the problem here. They are seeing a one-sided version of it here in the U.S. media. Isabel, I'd like to talk about some of the peripheral countries here, two countries that neighbor Colombia. Venezuela and Ecuador are neither major producers of cocaine or synthetic narcotics, but they serve as key transnational points and harborers of these designated foreign terrorist organizations. So they've also been sites of US military operations, and now have leaders who are very much amenable to working with the Trump administration in this regard. That with the new government in nearby Peru, the world's second largest coca producer, also pledging to crack down on foreign terrorist organizations in conjunction with the US. What impact do you think these military-led interventions will have on Andean drug markets, production trends, and transit routes? Do you see this working? Do you see this as a regional effort that actually might have some impact?
Well, an impact, of course, it will have. What we don't know is what will it cost to people living there. So, and in effect, we have now Keiko Fujimori, also fully aligned with the Shield of the Americas, also Colin Abelardo, a strong ally for her strategy as well. As you mentioned, Peru is not a main producer, but it does has coca production, transformation, and export. And the case of Venezuela, where it serves as routes and the full connection between some armed groups in the Colombia-Venezuela border that are able to operate in the Venezuelan territory as well. I think as Lee was mentioning as well, we're going to see again the balloon effect in numerous expressions of the balloon effect. With the balloon effect, essentially is once a market is pressed here, then it displaces over here. But it's not just the geographical displacement of the cultivation, which will happen. What had happened during Plan Colombia was that it moved into further areas, into more remote areas, and areas that are very key strategic ecosystems. So now we have to date that almost 45 to 48% of all coca cultivation in Colombia is located in national parks, forest reserves, indigenous lands, etc. And that is one of the risks that we can foresee with more integrated pressure into coca cultivation. But also another type of balloon effect is that technification seems to respond to pressures from interdiction and pressures in the market. So productivity per hectare has increased tremendously over the last 10 to 15 years. I don't quite remember the numbers, but so what a hectare of coca leaf would produce in cocaine or in pasta base has now increased tremendously. Because what people do is not only armed groups, but just growers themselves is, okay, if they're going to crack down on me, I have to make sure that I have more produce so that I diminish the risk from these pressures. So that's also some sort of the results that we can see in the making. I think that the issue is that it's all quite unpredictable as well, because we haven't seen in the past such will to cooperation as we're seeing at the moment, and what will this entail? For sure, in the case of the U.S. operations in the region, it will mean probably an increase in the boat strikes that have been happening in the Caribbean and the Pacific. To date, as recorded by WOLA, around 220 people have been killed through these operations. And we can foresee how the openness from the Colombia government, from the Peruvian government, from the Ecuadorian government, and Venezuela will facilitate more collaboration for these operations to take place. And that is a very worrisome thing that we are seeing right now, because before, of course, we had this tense relationship between the US and Colombia, but now it's fully engaged with collaborating for these operations. And in real terms, we won't see what hasn't been seen through any of these militarized operations, which is a significant reduction of the market. But most importantly, I think, is we will not see a significant reduction of violence. And I think this brings to the question, which is the goal of these policies? I think there is a conflict of what, as Guadalupe was saying, there is a conflict between what the US wants out of a policy and what the country, be it Mexico or Colombia, wants from that policy. For Colombians, the most pressing issue is about reduction of violence, right? But that is not completely coherent with the US interest. The US is interested in getting less cocaine going into the US or getting less fentanyl going into the US. But to achieve this two very different goals, usually the one that wins is the one to achieve supply reduction at the cost of actually increasing violence and not reducing it.
Yeah, I think that is probably the most succinct statement that I've heard so far in terms of a criticism of the drug war. We have very competing missions here, or priorities rather, with the U.S. Drug eradication or somehow like cutting off the supply, whereas Colombia and a lot of these other countries, including Mexico, want to end the violence, but you can't do one without getting the other. So I very much appreciate that. And in that spirit, Lee, I would love to talk to you a little bit more about the attack on those so-called drug boats, narco-terrorists in the Caribbean and in Western Pacific. Can you talk a little bit or give us a little bit of update on those operations, where they are today, whether they've had any impact, and whether they are precedent setting? Are we going to see every administration in the future just use the US military and these showy operations as if they are an end in themselves, that they are completing some sort of mission to eradicate drugs, whether or not on paper they actually are?
Yeah, it's a really important point, Kelley. I think that with these boat strikes, as Isabel mentioned, I mean, over 220 people killed and 60 plus incidents in both the Caribbean, Eastern Pacific. Interestingly, we've seen a break for the past 6 weeks or so. There haven't been any strikes, to my understanding, which could be for a number of different factors, perhaps the response to the earthquake in Venezuela. Or, I mean, the administration is claiming, at least a few months ago, testified to Congress, a senior Pentagon official, that there has been a reduction in the traffic, the amount of boats coming in, like 25% in each of the different theaters. But I think it really does set a difficult precedent for future administrations, especially because of the cost. I mean, the amount that was recorded by the Cost of War Project at Brown University of 4.7 billion for Operation Southern Spear, as well as Operation Absolute Resolve, which is what the operation to extract Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela cost. And then the Pentagon followed up more recently at a much lower figure of about 600, 700 million. That's more than the amount that was appropriated to Latin America for, for military operations in 2024. So again, you're spending billions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on this operation to, target boats that you haven't presented any evidence or proof that there's actually narcotics on there. And in many cases, there's, 10, if not more people on some of these boats, calling to question why a drug trafficking boat would leave so little space for the actual product, and leading many to believe that a lot of the boats that have been targeted are human smuggling operations, innocent migrants. There hasn't been much actual evidence that it's reducing drug flows to the United States, despite some fantastical claims by certain administration officials. I mean, you can look at the CBP border figures every month that get published, and the amount that seized at the border has either remained somewhat static or even increased, meaning that, as has been mentioned, these are highly adaptive networks that can choose whether to, through riverine routes, through aerial routes, through land routes, through containerized cargo. They can change the geography and send this product to Europe, which I guess you could make the argument it doesn't really affect U.S. national security, but it affects our allies, and there is sort of a burden onto our security and intelligence operations as well. I mean, we've seen trends of increased activity going through the DR, through the ABC islands in the Caribbean, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, as well as to Guyana and Suriname. So again, you're not really doing much to systemically degrade or to limit the reach or the finances or the influence of groups. You're basically just making them switch gears and change geographies, industries, and broader strategies. So, I mean, let alone the domestic and international legal considerations here, which really, if there is change in the U.S. Congress come November, I think we can expect to see a lot more robust oversight, hearings, and calls for accountability for some of the top administration officials who have ordered these strikes, given the facts that by many accounts they are at the very least extrajudicial killings, if not qualify as murder under U.S. law. Again, it's the equivalent of going out onto the street corner and shooting somebody who you say is selling drugs. It's just not how we do it. We board vessels, we, collect evidence, we seize the drugs, and then we use that to build cases. And that's worked for decades, and it actually continues to happen alongside some of these boat strikes. So it makes you really question why the boat strikes are continuing if we're still doing these maritime interdiction operations, as well as some of the other countries that have been complicit or involved in these operations by lending their airports, their lending intelligence, mostly in the case of Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Trinidad and Tobago, and others. I mean, I would be concerned, moving forward about the implications for their top officials that are involved in these strikes. And the administration claims it's part of a broader attempt to apply systemic friction. And I think in theory that sounds good if you're really giving as much energy and investing as many resources in your Treasury Department tools, in your Justice Department tools, in your Coast Guard tools, your Health and Human Services tools, and all of the other ways in which you can apply systemic friction to actually try to root out the drugs that are being produced and also trafficked. But just blowing them out of the water, I would say is counterproductive, and it doesn't really get at the heart of why these organizations, these operations exist and will continue to adapt and prove resilient, even if we blow them out of the water.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think everybody on the call would agree with that. I'm sorry if I said Western Pacific. I realize it's the Eastern Pacific, but I'd like to ask Isabel and Guadalupe: are these narco terrorist attacks, these continued strikes on these boats, are these more of intimidation tactics? Like we realize that they're not working, and I think even the Pentagon would probably agree off the record that they are just a drop in the bucket, if not counterproductive on some level. But I mean, are they just signals to the rest of Latin America, like, we can do this to you, we could do this to your people, and so you just kind of better get with the program? Anybody want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, just briefly on that, and I think you've described it as it's perceived, with an additional caveat. When it started to approach, I mean, when that operation started to approach, and it was clear that there was this U.S. military presence close off to the Colombian coast, it was also the moment where, as Maduro was extracted, there were clear concerns in Colombia that Petro would have the same fate. So it's a symbolic signal, but during the Petro administration, it was also felt like either Petro, he's already decertified, he's already like out of bank accounts, out of everything, blocked off of financial life. But either he complies and stops being his whole self, or he'll have a similar fate to Maduro.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
In Mexico, that's the same thing. And we're still concerned that we're going to be the next ones. I mean, I'm saying Mexico is going to be the next country that's going to be facing one thing or the other one, both strikes or drones and bombs through drones. This is an intimidation strategy. This is probably not very good either for the United States because, the public and other nations, probably other states and different parts of the globe are going to learn that this is just an intimidation strategy. This is all part of the national security strategy of 2025, which we all understand the Trump corollarium and the Monroe Doctrine, and the main goal of, taking China out of the picture and regain control over the territories of the Americas. We know what this is about. Anyway, the problem that we're facing in Latin America is real. The problem we're facing in Mexico with regards to violence is real. Extortion, kidnapping, violence overall, connected to very different actors that are, in a criminal ecosystem. There are notions among, for example, in Mexico, that the Sheinbaum government and also the AMLO's administration, the previous two administrations of the Eastern parties, have not been able to deal with this problem. So there is more and more expectation. There are more and more expectations with regards to the policies of Donald Trump. And I have heard, and I have been in several places that are, under control of criminal groups, the criminal networks, that they are saying, I want Trump to come, not understanding that there is a difference between United States national interests and U.S. interests, U.S. policies, and the policies that are needed for these communities to become safe. So this mismatch that Isabel was talking about is not recognized very well by the communities. There are spaces for cooperation. There's not an understanding of what we are talking about. We have not mapped the networks. What is national security interest? What has to do with drug trafficking? And what is another thing? And what the United States needs to regain control of the Americas overall. Because it's not only about intimidation strategies. It's not about only, placing different military bases all over the Americas to create a shield. It's to deal with the issues. And no, I think that things are not working, and definitely we are talking about intimidation, and other states are learning that the United States have the capacity to intimidate nations that are under the United States, but the United States have the capacity really to address the issues in its area of influence and beyond? I am not sure about that.
I mean, this is a question that always rises to my mind. Are there any Latin American leaders today that are pushing back against the Trump administration on some level and saying, no, we're not going to play this game? Or is it the opposite, where you see numerous leaders who are winning elections falling into line? Isabel?
Yeah, that's the worrisome trend that, as I've been joking around, but it's actually true, that the shield of the Americas will be impenetrable, right? Because everyone's joining. Before that, we had like some authoritarian far-right leaders that were aligning themselves with Trump, some of them in the region, but there was still Lula, Petro, Sheinbaum, raising the issue of sovereignty, having a lot of strong backing from our societies here to that narrative and content of defending sovereignty. And this has all gone in the different direction. We'll see how the Brazilian elections go. That will be very, very crucial for the region, because Lula is it's the other leader that has been sort of setting some boundaries for the region. But if not, then it really begs the question of understanding what is behind those interests from the U.S. Because it's clear that if as you were saying, Lee, there's this massive amount of resources sent to signal a symbolic intimidation, then that is the before of a material intimidation, and it's after something else. It can't be, and it doesn't sound rational, that so many money is being spent just for the sake of a symbolic intimidation. Is to be able, as they say, to go back to having Latin America be the back patio of the US, and is for some interest around resources. The pledge that was made over the weekend on the announcement from the State Department mentions, for example, rare minerals. And what will be the role to play of those extractive industries as the sequence of this cooperation will mean, yes, more technical assistance, more investment in the region, more et cetera, et cetera. But that is a facade of something else. And I think what we're
Yes.
understanding clearly is what is that something else.
Yeah, Lee, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that. You and I have had these conversations here at Quincy. I mean, how much of this drug war, this renewed drug war, how much of it is a pretext to greater control of the United States of, natural resources such as oil, natural gas, critical minerals, other supply chains that the United States wants to commandeer. I mean, it's no surprise that this announcement over the weekend regarding Colombia announced not only law enforcement and military cooperation, but economic cooperation and the opening of some of these industries to U.S. investment. Are we looking one way while something else that's equally important, if not pernicious, is happening?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kelley. I mean, I don't think we have to look any further than the Venezuela operation this January. I mean, the pretext that was used was that Nicolas Maduro was the head, supposedly, of the cartel of the Suns, as well as directing the Tren de Aragua, claiming that these are trafficking organizations, not just drugs, but other key transit routes and other illicit rents, and that that was the reason why this military-supported law enforcement operation had to occur to serve justice in service of criminal indictment. But soon afterwards, the Department of Justice dropped some of those claims that Maduro was involved with the cartel of the Suns. So I think that the drug pretext is often used for broader geopolitical goals, also securing U.S. supply chains in the case of Venezuela, of getting private U.S. multinationals back into the oil, the natural gas, the electricity, the critical minerals, the mining sector more broadly. I mean, there's been a lot of skepticism, I think, about whether the broad sort of U.S. push to remilitarize parts of South America and the region more broadly are about drugs. I mean, look no further than the pardon of former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez and other pardons of other online sort of dark web websites that are facilitating or channeling drug trafficking in one sense or another, and also just sort of the concern around other past leaders. I mean, in Latin America, the former president of Paraguay, for example, also had all of his sanctions lifted, and he was involved in a number of foreign corrupt practices, as alleged by past U.S. administrations and prosecutors. So I think that, again, there is a broader question of, is it about the drugs or is it about influence, as our military-led operations in other parts of the world flounder, as our leadership on a world scale is being increasingly questioned. Part of a great superpower's sort of role is to be able to supposedly have dominion over our near abroad, over our sphere of influence. And I think this is part of sort of the US's larger grand strategy under this administration, as was referenced by Guadalupe, and the national security and defense strategy of having aligned and cooperative, and in some cases subordinate leaders who also see it in their own best interest to invite greater U.S. cooperation on supply chains, on security, on economic deals, because it allows the U.S. to have greater control and leverage in our own backyard, which is a way to project power abroad. So, stay tuned for more research and work on this from the Quincy Institute about the security and critical minerals nexus, because it's a key challenge of how to think through, these really important natural resources for, not just our, but regional prosperity, for secure supply chains, for nearshoring, friendshoring, delinking, and decoupling, in this increasingly fraught sort of geoeconomic climate that we are living in, but without over-militarizing those supply chains and relying only on, security tools to be able to make sure that there aren't these sort of abuses and steamrolling over rule of law, and protecting U.S. and allied countries, firms' interests and activities abroad, legitimate business, but also making sure that it's not just benefiting the defense contractors and military industrial complex that Quincy Institute has done a lot of research on, that really have a lot of control over the conduction and direction of our foreign policy. So that's how I'd respond to that question.
I have a more maybe provocative question, flipping that on its head, and you kind of hinted at this, Lee. What's in the interest of these Latin American leaders? Do you think that in some cases, or could be down the road, that these Latin American leaders who are siding with Trump, particularly the right-wing ones, that are siding with Trump and they are falling in line on his desires and missions to crack down on narco-terrorism in the way that he does, is this a pretext for them to solidify control, to get rid of political rivals, to entrench their own power? I know that sounds kind of nefarious and conspiratorial, but did they see working with Trump as purely politically beneficial for them? Guadalupe, I saw you nodding, so.
Well, Latin American leaders, and now, identified with the far right, because this is the way that they are depicted today. Definitely, they are taking advantage of the shield of the Americas and the support of the Trump administration and the military support of the administration as well to solidify their capacities and the administrations overall, and they might be successful in that regard. Today, and there's the perception also of the voters. What I'm saying is that there is, the legitimacy of those governments is supported by an expectation that the problems that have not been solved by liberal or left-wing governments or center of left governments or other governments more connected with liberal values have not addressed the issues. So this is not just the leaders themselves, but it's we are talking about the voters. But what if the expectations, which I think because of the policies are not really addressing the problems that they are expecting to be addressed, that's why they are supporting the Trump administration and their leaders of, with this ideological posture, what is going to happen? If the shield of the Americas really does not shield the Americas as they should, right? And they're not addressing the issues, we're going to have a very, very big problem. And we're only in Latin America talking about the leaders of the Americas as if we were living in the 1990s or the beginning of this century. We're not living in that century. The polarization of the United States, the division, among the United States. Sometimes in Washington, we think that things have not changed in terms of geopolitics, and they have changed. The lack of, the fragmentation, the social fragmentation, social polarization of the United States add more complexity to these issues. We're not dealing with a regional leader that has its house clean and that, like in the 1990s, right? The winner of the Cold War. We're dealing with a country with a lot of issues, and drug abuse, drug addiction. Overdose, drug overdose deaths. It's a reality of this country. All these policies are not addressing the big social issues of the U.S. society. So just putting that on the table.
Thank you for that. Isabel, I'm going to give you the last word because we're at the top of the hour, but like, if you could just, send a clear message about, viewers who might be saying, well, okay, Trump invaded Venezuela in this effort to not only rid the region of a dictator, but in part to get at this drug issue, whether or not, like, we're not going to debate like the salience or the rigor of his arguments, but like, what kind of messaging did that invasion give the rest of the region? And could you talk a little bit, I guess, about whether or not that invasion, the imposition of the new Delcy Rodriguez leadership, has that done anything to address drug issues in Latin America and in America itself?
Yeah, so quickly on that, the short question is no, it hasn't done anything for the drug situation in the region. But I think again we're at a situation of a conflict of policy strategies, because when we look at the dimension of coca production, it's a development problem. Of course, we were talking before about the need for the US to reduce supply of drugs entering the country, and there's a massive public health crisis in the US associated with drug use of some substances. We're talking then about a public health policy. But when we move back into the chain, when it's the production dimension of the chain, we're talking about a development issue. And the regions, as Lee was mentioning, the regions where coca production is concentrated have no peace or development strategies directed to them. And including the US has reduced their investment into those spheres of policy. Unless we address those structural conditions that drive people into production of these substances, that is the only market available to them, we will still have some other municipality willing to provide the means to do so. And then with the problem is that we're having now with Abelardo, one of the many problems is that he's announcing to reduce 40% of the state's capacity. So there is an odds as well with that level of what will happen when militarized interventions will be the priority in the region, and peace and development policies have been abandoned both by the U.S. and will be abandoned by Colombia government as well, and even I think with the EU, and then people will be left to their own devices, subject to the control and power of this illegal armed groups. This is especially salient in the border with Venezuela, which is part of the question you were asking. One of the most grave humanitarian situations that the country has had recently is actually in that border, in the Catatumbo region, the Venezuela-Colombia border. The chaos and the power vacuum that is happening in Venezuela is allowing for these armed groups to take more control and hold of local populations and civilian populations. Again, it is a question of what are correct policies to reduce violence. And of course, we cannot do away with being naive and thinking that there is no place for some sort of military intervention. But the question behind that is what could be some more tactical, specific, nuanced, and actually targeting those who are inflicting violence, those who have power within the criminal networks or organizations, and those who are having control of the illicit flows. And the fact of the matter is that in Venezuela, with the power being still with what the regime was, then that is not being dismantled at all.
Right. And I think that's a theme throughout this entire conversation, is that the Trump administration has imposed what seems like simple, sharp, exact solutions or attempts on a very, very complicated problem. And so I know we're out of time. And I really appreciate us trying to get at some of that complexity on this webinar. But Lee, I really want to thank you for organizing this and allowing me to moderate it. I think much of your work is flowing through questions that you helped me formulate, but also through your work at Quincy, getting at this and convening other voices like Isabel and Guadalupe. And I hope we'll all, get back on another call, or I don't have to be there, but I know that Lee will be convening similar conversations, because this is not going away, and it could be getting a lot worse in terms of the further interventions that we're seeing in the hemisphere. So thank you so much. And thanks to the audience. I'm sorry we didn't get to your questions, but I really appreciate you coming on. And I don't think we have any future webinars planned, but we do have a book that came out just this week by one of our authors, Eli Clifton, with his co-author Ian Lustig over at University of Pennsylvania. They just released Israel's Lobby. It's a fantastic book. And so keep looking at the website, quincyinst.org, for not only future events involving that book, but future events involving all of our programs and studies. And thank you very much for joining us.